to another episode of Scaling Up with me, Jarrod Cairns.
And me, Michelle Holloman.
And today we're going to cover the really exciting topic of policies.
I actually think it is exciting.
It is quite exciting, yeah. So it's what you make of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Depends
Yeah.
what your frame of reference is.
I suppose. But joking apart, it is a really important part in it of managing a business, both from a practical sense of why do you need a policy, but through to a legal sense as well, that you have to have policies for certain things. And you know, I always talk about the people, processes, systems and data, and obviously it sits within that. For me, it sits in that process side of how do you manage the business, what things do you need to run your business, and also some of the mechanics of running a business and repeatable things. And I suppose actually take a step back, actually what is a policy? Maybe we should start there. Why do you even need a policy for things?
Yeah, and how I always describe it to clients is a policy is ultimately a framework, so you cannot account for everything in a policy. It is a document that is designed to give you a bit of a framework as to how you'll manage certain situations.
Yeah.
I know we've said we'll come on to it later in terms of the types of policies and where you might use them, but just high level, classic example for me is a disciplinary policy.
Yeah.
So what's the process to, kind of issue a warning effectively or to dismiss someone from employment? You would follow the framework that sits within that policy, and also in that policy you would quite clearly articulate these are the kind of things that are acceptable, these are the kind of things that are not, so that you can steer people in the right direction in terms of these are the behaviours that we expect, these are the standards we expect, and ultimately that's how I talk about policies to clients. So it's a framework, it sets the standard and the tone for your business. Often it's, people don't read them until things are going wrong, but I always say, make it feel like yours. I work with clients and write policies, and I do use kind of draft wording and templates that I've got, because time and time again these things come up. But ultimately I'll always meet with clients and say, what are your values, what's your culture like, let's understand that, and let's make sure that the policy itself and the framework aligns to all of that, and is worded in a way that sounds like you could have written it. It doesn't have to be really legalistic, it doesn't have to have lots of formal language, but what it does have to do is articulate almost a beginning, middle and end. This is why it's here, and this is what it all means for you, and why we're having it, and why we're saying we've got this policy in place, and this is what happens if you don't follow it. And I think that ultimately for me is the purpose of a policy, really. Yeah,
you're right. It's a practical document as well. It's a practical framework as well for, I don't know, I think in a almost a panicky situation, if something happens, I'm thinking things like disaster recovery, so maybe a little bit extreme, but what happens if all your computers turn off because you have a power cut? What's the policy around that, about sending people home, about working from home, about what do you do next? And quite often with those things, everyone goes into panic mode. Oh my God, what we should do? We'll open the policy booklet and have a read of what you should do, and it helps people then, doesn't it, in terms of step by step. Okay, well, the first thing we need to do is contact IT, or the first thing we need to do is send everybody home, or whatever that needs to be, inform customers. It's a practical document as well, and something that's repeatable, isn't it? That if you've got a policy on, I'm thinking from a small business point of view, I'm kind of thinking ahead of myself, maybe if I took a counselling business, what's my policy for booking? What's my booking policy? How often, what's your cancellation policy? What's acceptable? And it saves the winging it, doesn't it? It's like, oh, someone's cancelled, what shall I do about that? What do I tell them? Shall I refund them for that? What's your refund policy? So it helps that winging it, but it stops that winging it mentality, doesn't it? So actually, I've got a policy for this, and if this happens, this is what I do. I don't have to think about it because it's written down and it's documented.
Yeah, and something you just said there has made me almost think we need to clarify that as well, because from a policy perspective, when I'm thinking about policy, I'm thinking about internal measures, internal ways of working. So that might be our internal audience of, I'm an employee, what happens if I'm phoning sick? How do I book holidays? What happens if I've got a grievance? What happens if I need to whistleblow? What happens if I want to know what's happened to my data? They're all internal policies that I would talk about with clients, but you're absolutely right, we might have that external audience as well. So what is our cancellation policy if a customer cancels? What's our refund policy? What do we maybe we have a policy about, you know, how we look after the environment, you know, corporate social responsibility that's got an external audience because we're tendering for big projects. And if we're tendering for big projects, we want to demonstrate that, you know, we consider our environment, or if we're tendering for big projects, we want our potential customers to know that we don't accept, you know, kind of modern slavery. So we have a policy that talks about that. So there's all sorts of audiences as well when it comes to a policy. So it's not just, right, you've got your core policy documents from we're employing you, so you have to adhere to this as an employee. We've also got that external facing potential audience around. Actually, we have policies to make sure that you understand how we operate as a business. So if you want to come and work with us, or you want to be a customer of ours, or you want to work in some way with us in connection, that, you know, our policies sort of align to how you work as well.
Yeah, and sometimes it's difficult to know what policies you need because, again, in my experience, sometimes a policy is born when something goes wrong. And it's like, oh my God, what happens? What happens here? Well, we need a policy so that doesn't happen again, don't we? So they are an iterative process as well, aren't they? So, you know, I think just from what you were saying then, there are certain legal requirements around policies, particularly from a HR point of view, aren't there? There are certain things that have to be documented. There are certain things that have to be written in stone, and then there are other things from a how do I manage this business point of view that may come over time, because there are things that happen that you don't think about. And that could be, you know, the first time a customer returns something or wants to complain, you think, oh God, what do I do here? And the policy will be written thereafter. You know, there's many times when you review policies as well, I don't know if you found this, that you start to review the policy booklet or the policy folder. There'll be a policy in there that was written like 10 years ago that's never been used because of that. Something's happened once, we need a policy for this. And then it's, you know, it becomes obsolete because that thing never happens again. So I think the point I'm making there is that review cycle, isn't it? That, you know, it's important not to just write a policy or a set of policies and then leave them alone. And I think sometimes there is an inclination to do that. It's like, oh, it's just policies. They're fine, they'll sit in the background. But laws change, changing environmental policies, those kind of things. The world changes, and if you're not reviewing your policies in line with them, you could well find yourself in a bit of lumber if something goes wrong, and you, especially from a legal point of view, and your policy's out of date.
Yeah, absolutely. And often when I work with really small clients, rather than write lots of standalone policies, we start with a handbook, because often people haven't got anything in place. So they might have employed 3 or 4 people, and they say, I don't know what happens, and quite rightly, what happens if they're not performing? Well, actually, you should have had a performance policy in place. What happens if they've stole money out the till? Well, we follow a disciplinary policy. You know, there is other guidance and frameworks out there like ACAS that talks about how to conduct a disciplinary, but ultimately you should have something in-house if you are employing people. So often when I start working with someone, we create a bit of a handbook which covers all of those policies. But then as those companies grow, or some companies that I come to who've already got stuff like that in place, you'll often find they have a handbook, but then they have lots of standalone policies. And that is often exactly as you've said. What I find is if they are tendering for like government projects, a lot of projects will say, oh, you need to have a modern slavery policy, you need to have a whistleblowing policy, we need to know how you manage GDPR, we need to understand that you've got an equal opportunities policy. All great, and all things that you should have potentially. Modern slavery is a bit of a funny one because you've got to have a certain number of turnover, but I get it a lot in clients that I work with because they've been asked for that, so they've just created one, which is where I'd say make sure it's bespoke and actually fits with your organisation. But I do think, you know, you find often that it's not a one-time event, you know, as much as I will say to a client, okay, you've not got anything, let's sit down and create that. There's then obviously that subsequent check-in point. So how do we review that? You know, any of my clients that have been working with me for a number of years will know that we'll say, oh, actually there's new legislation coming out in April, so February, March, I'll probably start contacting them. We need to look at your handbooks, we need to look at any standalone policies, we need to kind of get them up to date and get them aligned to, you know, whatever's coming. And sometimes there's a need, because the legislation's changed, that we do have something that's standalone because it carries a bit more weight, it's a bit more gravitas to say we've got a standalone policy that's really important for us. But they're absolutely not a one-time event for me. It is that, how do we have that review cycle? How do we make that cyclical? How do we make sure that someone's kind of got governance of that and ownership of it? Because you're right, 9 times out of 10 as well, you see there's like a folder buried in someone's shared point, and no one's ever looked at them since the inception of them, and then something happens, and the first question I always ask is, but what does it say in the policy? And a lot of the time people sort of look at each other like, I don't know, have we got a policy on that? And I think that's the other thing to say, that yes, it's a written document and it's a record of your framework and how you'll approach things, but as a leadership team, as a business owner, as a manager, you should understand what your company policies are, because you are expected to manage and govern in line with that. And I often find that, I'll talk to a manager about disciplinary and I'll say, have you actually read the policy? And it's just a blank face. 9 times out of 10 don't really have one. So.
But ownership, you mentioned ownership there, and that's really important. Who owns a policy? And again, who has overall responsibility for the policy, like say the SharePoint folder that sits in someone's drive. So again, I've always found with policies, when you write in a policy document, that the policy document contains that kind of information. It's not just the policy, it's who owns it. So it could be a policy around product management, or how you build a product and how you put a pricing policy together, and who owns that, because it's not always the same person, is it? And again, I think sometimes there is that that belief that, I don't know, the quality manager, for example, if your business has a quality manager, they own anything to do with policy writing and things, or HR person, again, is another typical, your HR, you own all the policies. Well, with the greatest respect, what do you know about product development? It's not in your wheelhouse, is it? So that ownership is really, really, really important, isn't it?
Yeah, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear that I get that a lot of like, can you review our policies? And then clients will send me a batch or send me a link, and I'll go in a folder, and it is things like complaints policy or our booking procedure, or I did have one that had a sharps policy because they were like in a clinical setting, and I was like, this is not kind of my expertise, and I'm not going to pretend it is, and kind of try and blag that. But then also, I've been in other situations where I've worked alongside a quality manager who has written all the policies, because that's been his remit before, and I've gone into an organisation and gone, where did you get this? And they've said, oh, he just Googled it. We didn't have one on that, and we were tendering for something, so I just Googled, what a policy on disciplinary looks like, or what a policy on IT security, I think that was the one that kind of made me think, who's written this? Because it was at IT security, and it talked about do not leave things in the trunk of your car, and I was like, this is not UK. Is, and then it came out that there was just a Google exercise, and all of a sudden someone's crafted this policy, and I was like, right, actually, how do we transport data? What do we do with IT equipment? And then you have that meaningful conversation, and then write a policy that fits that. Rather than just like AI, which is a classic actually, and probably worth us talking about as part of this conversation, because again, I encounter people who say, oh I just AI'd a policy, or AI'd an employment contract. But how do you know that what's in that is legally compliant, is the right thing to be in there, that the language is correct, that the potential consequences are correct? Are they aligned to what goes on in the UK in terms of that kind of any sort of potential action off the back of conduct issues or processes going wrong, or if you want to take action against your employee, or you're the employee and you want to know what recourse you've got against your employer, how do you know that what's written in that policy, if you've written it on AI, is aligned to UK legislation? Because often it's not, and you do come across that quite frequently.
Absolutely. Sometimes with policies, it's almost a worst case scenario approach, isn't it? It's the what if question. What if this goes wrong? What if somebody does take us to a tribunal? What if a customer does report us for false advertising? Again, what is the policy? And I can't remember where I'd heard it, or someone told me at some point, sometimes not having a policy, sometimes is not okay, but it's a fair, well, actually we haven't got a policy for that, so we didn't know what to do. Whereas if you've got a policy that you don't follow, it's far worse than not having a policy at all. So if that question gets asked in a legal sense, what does your policy say? And your policy says you do X, Y, and Z, but you've done A, B, and C instead. It can be quite crucial, can't it? And I guess just saying, going off what you were saying then about AI, if you've built a policy on AI and actually factually and legally it's incorrect, and you followed that, the implications of that are actually quite serious.
And I'm smiling because, interestingly, I've had a conversation this week with a client. So, talk about the situation, obviously without naming anyone, but this particular client, they had an issue with someone basically walking off site because of a drugs test, and they thought, I'm going to fail that drugs test. Turns out they hadn't ever issued the policies that we'd written, but they also then, when I said, well, there's obviously we need to potential gross misconduct, they're in a safety critical role, so we need to follow a process, and regardless of whether or not they've seen that policy, we need to follow a process. And if we can't find alternative work for them, you know, it's designed to be a neutral act, but equally we might need to suspend. Anyway, several days went past, and when I managed to get hold of them, they're just back on site doing a safety critical role. So we'd almost, regardless of whether or not that policy sat there, the reality is what that person had done was so serious because they had failed to, you know, kind of make themselves fit for work in a role that obviously has potential huge implications, you know, health and safety perspective, could have caused an accident, injury, could have caused death to someone, you know, statutory directors on the hook for all sorts. So, you know, the fact that they then just did nothing because it turned out they'd never issued this policy actually made it worse, that you know, they hadn't followed some sort of process. You know, from that, then it makes my job harder to an extent, because then we almost have to say, okay, we're drawing a line, this is where we are now saying this is what's acceptable, and you know, should you fail to adhere to that, then we'll follow this policy and take some action. But actually in that scenario, you're absolutely right, the fact that whether they'd issued that policy or not, there was something so serious that they'd done that we should have still acted on it, and then by allowing them back on site, we've diluted how serious that is anyway.
Well, that's you've diluted them for the rest of the staff, haven't you? But again, you're going back to that, you know, the what if test. What if that person then does cause an accident in the future and nothing's been done this time? You know, there's a potential that coming around and biting you quite hard on the backside.
100%, yeah. And I think it's learning that lesson, isn't it? And you hope that, you know, people learn that lesson without having to have that such a serious impact and implication. But it could be the case, and I think again sometimes with clients, that's, you hope it's not you, but you know, I don't know if it's something like this 5. I don't know where I've got this stat from, but maybe 5 deaths a year, like corporate manslaughter, like across the UK. That might be completely wrong, and that might be out, but I'm sure that's what someone told me. But why is that not you as the employer? That could be you, and if that was you, that's the impact. You know, you've allowed someone on site who said they're under the influence, who's you know, kind of doing a role that, you know, means that actually if something happens, you're on the hook as an employer for corporate manslaughter, and you are the one facing a potential prison sentence. So, you know, it's actually that serious.
And all because you had a policy that was written that was perfectly sound, but you just
didn't follow.
Well, you didn't issue it in the first place,
Well,
so you didn't follow it. But again, I think that it's an important point, isn't it, in terms of the starting point for policies. Is, you know, probably one of the first policies you should have in place is your induction policy. So when new people join the business, your induction policy says you need to read the policies and sign them, so that, you know, you can prove that you've issued them, and someone can prove that they've read them, whether they choose to read them or not. Again, it's almost a bit of you pushing a bit of responsibility back on people, because then if they fail to follow that policy or are in breach of the policy, you've signed it. You said, you know, there's got to be a trust element somewhere, haven't there? You've signed the policy, and in good faith, I presumed you'd read the policy, unless you do a test at the end.
And I've known companies do it various ways. That's why I always start with a handbook. When it's a smaller organisation, I think people get overwhelmed by, you've got to read 30 policies, and like you quite rightly said, there are some things that I would say absolutely start with that and make sure you've got policies. But you can have all sorts of policies. You mentioned earlier, disaster recovery, adverse weather is one. I wouldn't say it's an absolute vital, but you know, the reality is that some companies by stealth, because of certain circumstances, grow the policy suite, and all of a sudden they've got 35 policies, and someone turns up on day one and you say sit and read that. It's just not, you know, it's the most mind-numbing task in the world to sit and read that, and I read these things day in, day out, but you know, even I would think I'm not reading 30 policies. I think that's why a handbook is a really good way to kind of start off, because it might be 30 pages, but actually, you know, you can kind of get that digestible information in a shorter format that ultimately means that people know what's expected. But I would absolutely say, you know, if you've got, so I'm not a health and safety expert, I'll just caveat with that, but I understand from the health and safety executive, if you've got more than 5 employees, you should absolutely, it's mandatory to have a health and safety policy. Like I said, that's not necessarily my skill set, but from an employment perspective, your written statement of particulars should list certain things that should include either a disciplinary grievance or a reference to, you know, kind of what disciplinary and grievance policies are, where they're kept, how you can access them. I'd also say, you know, have something like sickness absence. Make sure you've got something about equal opportunities and equality, because if you are ultimately found to have discriminated, we've been really clear with you what is and isn't acceptable. The Equality Act's there for a reason. And then like data protection, whistleblowing, they're also really significant policies that I would say make sure you've got something along those lines, so people understand, one, what happens with data that we hold for them, and two, how we expect them to treat customer data. And then whistleblowing is just a really key policy on the basis of, you know, if you see something that isn't right and you haven't got an internal avenue to be able to raise that, then, you know, if it's in the public interest, you should be able to understand how you can escalate that, so that, you know, there's no kind of inappropriate activity that an organisation's undertaking and that's hushed up because no one knew how to report it externally.
And I think some of the other policies that are important, you know, not necessarily from a legal point of view, but almost, you know, those contentious policies that exist, things like expenses policies and bonus policies and those kind of things that are, you know, are kind of written down somewhere, so there's no confusion, there's no ambiguity around what you can and you can't claim on expenses. You know, I've seen many a heated argument over what people think they can and they can't claim on the expenses policy because it's not been written down somewhere, and so people will you know, make their own rules up then, don't they? And then, so we're not paying for that. Well, why not? I think it's a valid expense. Well, no, it's not, but because it's not documented somewhere. You know, those contentious things, you know, company car usage, you know, what you're allowed to claim petrol for, you're not allowed. And again, some of it's tax implications and legal things within that, but if it's not documented somewhere, you are going to get, you know, you're going to get conflict, aren't you, at some point, especially things around company bonuses is a good one. You know, I've worked in a couple of businesses where it kind of gets to the end of the year and, but were we getting a bonus or not? Well, I'm not really sure. And it's kind of up to someone, usually the finance guy or the MD, to decide, yeah, you've all been good this year, so I'll give you a bonus. And it can, you know, it can cause problems then, can't it? It can build up resentment then if people don't get it. Whereas if it's written down clearly, your bonus is reliant on this and this happening, and if it does, then yes, you get it, and if it doesn't, no, you don't get it, then everybody's really clear, aren't they? So I think for clarity within a business, your policies are really important. So again, there's no ambiguity. People can't say, well, you never told me that, and I wasn't expecting it, or I was expecting that because I have something I've made up, rather than, no, it's documented. Yeah,
and that's why policies for me are really important, because it is about setting that expectation. And I think for me, one of the things I will often do is work with a client and say, like, almost what's that employee life cycle? So if someone joins your business day one, what are they expecting? You know, do we offer things like overtime, toil? So it might not feel like it's really like sexy important stuff, but the reality is someone wants to know, am I getting double time for overtime? Do I just get paid my normal rate? Can I, if I need to go to the dentist, do I have to work that time back? Do I get that? How, you know, how does that work? And I think almost that employee life cycle, you know, if someone's then going to take maternity, paternity, adoption leave, any, you know, kind of family friendly leave, if they're going to be with you a few years, likelihood is they might end up having, you know, to take a period of family leave. Where do we document that? Where do we tell people what they're entitled to? Flexible working, you know, people's things change. How do we document all of that and make sure that, you know, there's something clear that doesn't have to be, like I say, it's only a framework. It doesn't have to be, if you Joe Blogs join on the 5th of January, then it's this, or if you join on the 6th of April, it's this. You know, it just needs to be something that actually is, if you've, you know, joined us and you've got this service, then this is what's eligible, and please speak to your line manager, or please speak to, you know, the person responsible for this policy, which might be HR, finance, whoever that might be. But I think you're right, and like on bonuses, I often see that, you know, there's not any sort of framework in place. We know that might change year on year, but you are absolutely right. You almost want to set out, right, 25% of your bonus is linked to personal objectives, 75% to corporate objectives. You know, what happens if you're on maternity leave? What happens if you're still in your probationary period? All that kind of stuff, like high level framework, so that there's no ambiguity around, am I eligible for this or not? And you know, going back to, you know, those conversations then about psychological safety and well-being, people knowing what is or isn't on offer and how they achieve it is important for that, because again, it does build up resentment. People start to, well, am I going to get some money at Christmas so I can buy extra Christmas presents? So it feeds into that psychological safety conversation as well, doesn't it? And
you know, the other thing with policies, it's a protection for the business, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if you've got a policy in place that protects your business, you mentioned before about like information security and IT policies around, you know, making sure you're using two-factor authentication, making sure you're not sending emails outside of the business, or, you know, emailing documents to yourself on a personal email address, and those things that sometimes feel really petty. But, you know, interesting, we had a conversation before we started filming, didn't we, about people hacking email addresses and things, and it's so easy to do, and it's so prevalent that these policies are in place for protection, aren't they, to stop people doing things. And you know, I must say, in the past I've been guilty of it myself. I'll just send this home and I'll do it tonight when I get home on my computer, because I haven't got time in the office. And there's a reason why, you know, there was no policy in place, by the way, at the time. That was a long time ago, just to caveat it. But there's a reason why those things are in place, aren't they? And again, it's going back to that what if conversation. How do we stop cyber attacks? What do we need to do? Well, let's make sure the policies are really tight around what's acceptable and what isn't, so that, you know, we're protecting the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's like you say, it's that it probably won't happen, but what if it does? And I think we have to have that awareness that these things do happen to someone. And I always talk about with legislation, that legislation that's come out, employment law, that, you know, kind of changed last year, will be because there was a high profile case in the tribunals and everyone went, oh, there isn't really any framework around the legislation for that. What do we do? So they've relied on case law. They've created, you know, kind of a precedent through case law. Well, that wasn't acceptable by the employer. So now all employers, classic one I always talk about is Uber drivers who complained that they were employees and therefore they were entitled to sick pay. I mean, that's probably about 10 years old now, maybe longer. But that then set precedent and then became law because, you know, there was nothing in place. And it's the same policies. Like you say, like all policies are that devolved kind of responsibility from government to employers to say you are now responsible for employing people and therefore you must follow this legislation. How you do that, interpret that for your organisation and apply it is largely up to you as the employer, but this is the legislation we're setting, so that you then know how to, you know, kind of take that forward ultimately and kind of have something to navigate through when you do need to discipline someone or you do need to manage someone's sickness absence or someone is going on maternity leave. You need to understand that as a business owner or a manager. How do I then navigate this and make sure that the employee gets what they're entitled to? And also, absolutely, as you said, commercially we protect the business. You know, if there's a risk of someone's conduct falling foul of our expectations, then how do we address that in the right way without, you know, kind of putting us at risk?
Yeah, and again, it's funny you talk about that, you know, where precedent's been set about where policies and procedures and regulations come from. And again, I had a conversation this week about industry regulations, and it was a similar kind of thing. And you know, have to excuse me French for this, but you know, someone said it's a little book of fuck-ups, because every regulation that's written in that book came because somebody made a mistake at some point and it caused a problem or an accident, and so a regulation was written. It's the same with policies, isn't it? And when we go back to what we said near the beginning, it's very much an iterative process, isn't it? Because you can't predict everything, and life will happen, the world will happen around you, and sometimes fuck-ups will happen. And like, actually, let's make sure that doesn't happen again, and we'll learn from experience, and we'll put a policy in place that stops it. So it is about learning as well, and you know, sometimes you have to hold your hands up, don't you? Say, actually, we didn't think about that, because we didn't know it's going to happen, but now we do. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again, and it might never happen again. Going back to that review process, it could be 10 years down the line, you've got a policy that the world's changed now, you don't need it anymore. So don't be afraid to retire some of your policies as well. Yeah.
What's the best policy you've seen, or title of a policy?
Oh God, that's a good one. I don't really know, actually. You should have prepared me for that one. Best policy I've seen.
Should I go first?
Well, you go first one, I think.
Yeah, only...
You've obviously got one in your mind.
Based on what you were just saying there about, like, that's come about because something happened. I'm sure they won't mind me sharing. I've got a client that is in a theatre, and when I was asked to look at their policies, the first one was called Animals and Weapons on Stage policy, and I was like, wow, I think that's way out of my remit. Like, I haven't got a clue what the legislation would say about that. But obviously that came about because in that sector it was something that they needed some sort of guidance around. What do we do if we've got an animal on stage? What do we do if we've got a weapon on stage? I mean, I hope that it's not because someone at one point was wielding an axe, or you know, someone did something they shouldn't do with the animal or something. But yeah, ultimately, like you know, that has come about because that was relevant. But I remember thinking, like, what do you want me to do with that? When they shared that, I was like, I don't think I can comment on that
no,
one.
I don't think I can top that, even if I thought for a while, because I've always worked in really quite boring corporate roles, so it's all been company car policies and things like that. So no, I don't think I could beat that. I'm going to give it some thought. To see
but we'll come back and revisit that one. But yeah, you're right. I think like it's when something happens and like you say that little book of F-ups, like the right thing, isn't it? It's often how things are born.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And be honest about the fact that we didn't foresee this happening, but now it has. Chance of it happening again might be really slim, but let's make sure if it does, there's a step process that says, right, if this happens again, this is what we do, this is how we follow it, this is how we mitigate any risk or anything around it. But yeah, it's actually more of an interesting topic than.
Yeah, see, I told you it was a good one for us to do.
We gave it credit for. But it's really important where we've kind of joked a lot about it because it can be quite a dry subject, but having those protections in place, both from a business and a commercial and a people point of view, is so important, isn't it? And it's also really helpful as well because you can't think of everything all the time, and sometimes it is good to go, that thing hasn't happened for a while, what would we do? Well, let's go and have a look at the policy book that we wrote about it, and it's there and it helps you and it reminds you and guides you. It just keeps the business safe, doesn't it? Keeps it ticking along.
Yeah, look at COVID when that happened and everyone had to go and work from home. There was very few companies that were already doing that and had any sort of policy guidance around using your own equipment, issuing company equipment, what happens if your location of work is changing, what's the then hybrid policy around how many days a week you come in the office when everything started coming back about. So and a lot of companies I work with now will have like a working from home policy or a hybrid policy because they wanted to put some governance around it because then people were going, I'm working from home on Tuesday, I'm not in on Friday, and then it just became a free-for-all. And I think on the flip side of that, people wanted a bit of reassurance from their employer that you can still work from home a couple of days a week. When you joined us, the world was different, and you've got the infrastructure set up to do that now. So it is an interesting one. What's your kind of final bit of advice then for someone who is listening to this going, wow, we haven't got a thing in place?
I think the advice I would be is be open-minded about policy because, again, I think we joked at the start that it can be quite dry, but it's really important to your business and you've got solid policies in place. So don't shy away from it. Don't think that's a job for tomorrow, because tomorrow something might happen that could get you in trouble if you haven't got a policy in place. And I think the second bit of advice that you think you covered really well is that review. Is don't just write a policy, stick it on someone's SharePoint and leave it in a corner with no responsibility. Is have that review cycle, have that ownership around the policies so that it, because great example at the end there, the world changes very quickly and really unexpectedly. So make sure that review policies, procedures in place so that you can change and that your policies do become iterative. Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you. Anything else to add, or are we all done policy? No, I'm more policied out, I think, for today, but no, it was a lot more exciting than I gave it credit for.
Good, I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, I think for me, the final thing I would say is that employee life cycle, certainly when you're thinking about your HR policies, almost just walk through, right, someone joins us, what do we need? Do we need a recruitment policy? Do we need, onboarding policies, all that kind of stuff, all the way through to actually if someone's exiting, is it redundancy? Are they resigning? We don't have retirement anymore because we don't discriminate age-wise, but we might have a process in place that, we don't know. If someone says, I am retiring, because that's how they see it, we might say, well, we'll give you, so much per department money-wise to buy something, that kind of thing. So I'd almost do that life cycle from beginning to end and then work out what you do, what your normal practice is, and then speak to someone like myself as well to say, right, okay, we don't actually know, we've never had anyone go on maternity leave or paternity leave, or we've got someone who's asked flexible working, like what does it all mean? And then we can tie all that together as well and make sure that legislatively it's accurate.
And likewise, actually, I think it's a good point just to finish on is you've got your, as you say, your employee life cycle, but think about your customer life cycle and your, the way that you work life cycle. How do you process an order? What is your policy for taking credit card payments? Those kind of things. Think about your business and the steps that you have to take within your business just to exist. And protect yourself. And again, someone like me, we're more than happy to come in and ask all those what if questions. because sometimes you don't think of the what ifs.
Yeah.
And it takes a different pair of eyes. Go, what happens if something goes wrong there, or worst case scenario? So, yeah.
Fab.
Bro.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to us today. That's scaling up. I'm sure there'll be another one very soon.
There will. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Jarrod.